evening, Father, may we learn the things that are there for us, things most needful to us at this time. We acknowledge our sins this afternoon, Father, and as we repent of them, we beg God forgiveness of them. We're thankful for this opportunity of assembling together. We're thankful for the provision of that opportunity. We ask you now to go with us through the rest of this service. Continue thy watching care over us. Forgive us our every sin, Father. We ask it in our Lord's holy name. Amen.
Well, good evening. Would you join me, please, in Genesis 37? We'll start there. We won't spend much time in chapter 37, but we're going to get started there. Going to talk about Joseph and his brothers tonight. And really, we're going to take kind of a narrow look at the story. I'm kind of operating under the assumption that we've all recently read through the section, and so we are familiar again with the material that's there, and we know how things went with Joseph and his brothers. How many brothers did Joseph have, just to kind of get us going? 11, right, 11 brothers. They are the 12 sons of Israel, whose name was Jacob. Okay, so we're kind of on track. It says in verse 1 of chapter 37 that Jacob lived in the land where his father had sojourned, the land of Canaan, and then we're introduced to Joseph as a 17-year-old young man. Did Joseph and his brothers get along? Everybody kind of knows they did not get along, and things were difficult for them. Now, we're going to jump ahead. Hold on to that. And now we jump ahead to how the story really wraps up. Joseph is in Egypt. He is second in command. We might call him the vice pharaoh, however you want to look at that. He's second in command, and he is responsible, by God's good grace, for really saving Egypt, right? He puts Egypt in a position that is unlike any around them because of what? A great big famine, yeah. And so Joseph, with God's help, is in a position to help Egypt be the place everybody comes to because they need grain and Egypt has grain. We have the benefit this evening, just starting out, you can see the pyramids there. I put those up there because I like them. They don't have anything really to do with the story. But what might have something to do with the story is this. Now, if you'll take a quick look at this, you might see somebody you recognize in the picture, the big picture there. And I'm going to ask Richard to give us a little bit of information because he has literally been, well, where he was in the picture. Where is that, Richard?
This is right out near the pyramids. And these are the ruins of what they believe now are the storage facilities, the granaries. Joseph had constructed. This pit right here is probably 70, 80 feet deep. And they go down into the bottom of this, and there's a stairs kind of wrapped around, spiral stair going down. And then it branches off into this huge underground cavern where they were found all kinds of jars of grain and things like that.
Okay.
The other picture back there were administrative offices, buildings right there behind where people can come in and request their ration of food and take care of that. It's all real close to the pyramids there.
Very good. That is just fascinating to me because it helps us tie together what we picture in our minds when we read about this. Because if Egypt has this great store of grain, and we know they do because folks are coming to buy it, then they had to have a place to what? Store it. And so we know about that. We can imagine that, and then we get pictures like this, and it just kind of helps us get it straight in our minds as to what was going on and the role that Joseph actually played. Joseph becomes the gatekeeper, if you will, for all of the folks who come and need grain. We'll see that as the story develops. So go with me now to chapter 42. Go with me to chapter 42. We're going to just kind of work our way through chapter 42, chapter 43, and then 44. And that's really what we're going to do. But we'll jump around a little bit because of the material that is in there. So, you're familiar with Joseph and his brothers. You got all that. Now let's go to chapter 42 and verse 1, and it has a little bit of, to me at least, a little bit of humor in it. I don't know if you read a little bit of humor in it, but it kind of makes me laugh when I read it. Jacob, the father, saw that there was grain in Egypt, and Jacob said to his sons, "Why are you staring at one another? Behold, I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us from that place so that we may live and not die." Kind of sounds like your typical dad's response to a bunch of folks that are sitting around, well, staring at one another. And we have a problem. We don't have enough food. And so why are you sitting around here staring at each other? Let's go solve this problem, is kind of the way Jacob seems to deal with it. And so it says in verse 3, the 10 brothers of Joseph went down to buy grain from Egypt. When it says the 10 brothers, and we've already established that there were 11 brothers, what do you know right off the bat most likely here? That Benjamin's probably not amongst them. Benjamin is the oldest or youngest? By a pretty good margin would be the youngest, and so he's probably not in the 10 when it says 10. We're not told that specifically here, but we understand that as we read through it. It becomes quite evident. But when you see 10, you get that. Verse 4. Benjamin didn't go. There you go. That's even better when you go to the next verse. So, no Benjamin, the 10 older ones are going. By the way, where's Joseph on that birth order list? Is he toward the top or is he down here toward the bottom with Benjamin? He's the next youngest. Okay, so we're dealing with the 10 older ones. They go down to Egypt to buy some grain. It says in verse 6, as we've already mentioned, Joseph was ruler over the land. He was the one who sold all the people of the land, and his brothers came and bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. Verse 7, when Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he disguised himself to them and spoke to them harshly. And he said to them, "Where have you come from?" And they said, "From the land of Canaan to buy food." And Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him. Now, first thing I want us to notice is Joseph calls them spies. He accuses them of being spies. Now, what I have done is I've just picked out a few little things in these chapters that got my attention, that would give us an opportunity to have some discussion if you want to have some discussion about these things. So Joseph accuses them of being spies in verse 9. He says, "You're spies." They say, "No, we're not." He says, "Well, yes, I believe that you are. In fact, I'm going to put a plan in place to figure out if you are spies or not." Now, he recognizes them, right? He knows they're not spies. So it's an interesting thing that he would do that. So hold on to this idea of you're here to spy out our land. You're here to look at us. You're here to see what you can see. And go back to chapter 37 with me. Remember in chapter 37 in verse 2, it says, Joseph, when 17 years of age, was pasturing the flock with his brothers while he was still a youth, along with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought back a bad report about them to their father. Joseph goes back and he kind of tattles on his brothers to his father. And I just wonder if that was one of those moments where his brothers kind of looked at him as if you're out here spying on us. They're older, they're doing their thing, and he's the young one, and he takes back the bad report, and now they kind of view him as the infiltrator who's spying on them and reporting back. Joseph here in chapter 42 calls them spies, and he says, that's what y'all are doing. You're here to spy out our undefended land as if you're going to attack us. Well, they answer back and say, no, that's not it at all. And then they say, your servants are 12 brothers in all, verse 13, sons of one man in the land of Canaan. And behold, the youngest is with our father today, and one is no longer alive. What do you make of the one is no longer alive? How would you conclude about that? Yeah, they considered him to be dead, right? They didn't know for sure, but they kind of just figured that that's what happened. They knew when they last saw him what they had done to him. They did not kill him, right? They sold him to Ishmaelite traders who were headed for Egypt. And so they know all of that, and their presumption, though, is that by this time, he's dead. How long has it been? No, he's 30. So about 13 years has passed, and they've heard nothing. And so they just operate on the basis of Joseph is dead. And they don't know who they're talking to, so that's what they say. But Joseph in verse 14 insists. He says, you're spies, and this is what we're going to do. I'm going to put you all in jail. So he puts them all in jail. Then he brings them out 3 days later, and he says to them, here's the new plan. Here's what we're going to do. You're going to bring your youngest brother to me. Now that's one of the things I find interesting about this, that it is that youngest brother that Joseph wants brought. Why is that interesting to me, you think? Why might that be interesting? Okay. It's his whole brother. They're the ones who had the same mother, right? Which they had the same father, but not all the brothers had the same mother, which we've discussed a little bit. But what was Joseph when they were out there and they sold him? What was he to them at that moment? He was the youngest out there, right? He was the youngest one. And what would you presume the older should do for the younger? Should protect them, should watch out for them, should see to them. And they did the exact opposite of that. And so Joseph says, you bring me your younger brother. It may be that he's wanting to see how their attitude is toward that younger brother. How do they relate to that younger brother? Do they care about that younger brother? They didn't care about him. Do they care about the, quote, replacement for him? Are they interested? What's their attitude? And so they say, okay, that's what we'll do. But a part of that is one of you has to remain here and be confined here. And that, of course, was Simeon. We find that out in verse 36, that Simeon's the one they left behind. Joseph tells them in verse 19, let one of your brothers be confined in the prison, and the rest of you go carry grain for the famine in your households, and bring your youngest brother to me, so that your words may be verified and you will not die. And they say, okay, we'll do it. So Simeon gets left behind. Where is he in the birth order of all of this? Remember the song? He's number 2, yeah. And the only way we know that is because we know the song, right? We can sing the song. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, yeah. So he is the number 2 brother. Now we know a little bit about him. How would you describe Simeon? Well, and Levi, his brother. What would you say about them? Yeah, they're pretty violent folks, aren't they? In fact, in chapter 49, when Israel blesses his sons, remember that? He has all of them kind of come before him. In chapter 49 there, that's exactly what their father, Jacob, Israel, says about Simeon and Levi. You're violent. You're just violent people. And so he's the one that's left behind. But what's really telling in all of this is what happens when the 9 brothers leave. They leave Joseph. They leave Simeon. Benjamin is at home. When the 9 leave, verse 21 of chapter 42. Then they said to one another, truly we are guilty concerning our brother, because we saw the distress of his soul when he pleaded with us, yet we would not listen. Therefore this distress has come upon us. Reuben answered and said, did I not tell you, do not sin against the boy, and you would not listen? Now comes the reckoning for his blood. They didn't know Joseph could hear what they were saying. They didn't know Joseph understood that. So all of this has transpired, but it has brought these 9 brothers to a point where they are recognizing what we did was wrong. It was bad, and this is the reckoning for the bad. Yes, sir.
They weren't really wanting to go back to their father and say, hey, we're going to take Benjamin back.
Yeah, when we get to that part, they know what's coming. Now, the guy I have a little bit of sympathy for in the whole process is the violent Simeon, because there he is in prison in Egypt. Let's go ahead and move to that. You get verses 21 and 22 and the significance of that, right? The significance of them owning up to what we did to our brother. We should not have done that. That was the wrong thing to do. And of course, we get information here that we didn't get when they actually did it. When they actually did the deed and threw him in the pit and then pulled him up out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelite traders, when all that happened, we don't hear from Joseph. Remember that? We don't hear from him. We hear from the brothers talking, but we don't hear anything from Joseph. But in 21, we hear from Joseph, don't we? And what do we hear from Joseph? Yeah, he was crying out to them. You can easily figure out what he may have been saying, something along the lines of, don't do this. You're my brothers, don't do this. But they recall it, they remember it, and they acknowledge it. And so all of this that Joseph is doing, here we have a little bit of a clue as to the benefit that can come out of all of this. They're beginning to see the significance of what they did. So, yes, sir.
When I look at that last phrase of verse 18, I've often wondered if that prompted their response. Now, wouldn't they find it odd that an Egyptian would say, I fear God? And I don't know, I may be making too much of that, but I would think a guy that they has portrayed himself as not even being able to understand their language because he's speaking through an interpreter, yet he said, I fear God.
Well,
And does that prompt the response by Reuben that, oh, you know, God's, we're getting recompense now for what we did. God is involved.
yes. However, I want you to hold on to that because we're going to revisit that when we get over into chapter 43 a little bit, because we have another reference to God by the head of Joseph's household. And then we have the challenges in chapter 44 of the cup of divination. So we're going to try to hook all that together when we get there. Good catch, by the way, when he says, I fear God, in verse 18 of chapter 42. So, verse 35, the brothers head back home without Simeon. Their father, Jacob, in verse 36, says Simeon is no more. His view of it is, well, pretty practical. By the way, Jacob appears to be a little bit dramatic from time to time, but we'll just leave it there. Is that sufficient? His view is Joseph is gone, and now, because of what you guys did, Simeon is gone. And now, in the next chapter, well, we're not going to talk about that anymore. It's really interesting how it works. If you look at what happens beginning in verse 36, Jacob says, you've bereaved me of my children. Simeon is no more. Joseph is no more. And you would take Benjamin? You really want to take Benjamin down there and go through this process with him? He says in verse 37, Reuben spoke up. This is really helpful by Reuben, by the way. Reuben speaks up and says, you may put my two sons to death if I do not bring Benjamin back to you. Put him in my care and I'll return him to you. Is that really helpful information for us, Reuben? Not so much. No, that really doesn't solve a problem. It doesn't fill a gap. That just creates more problems on top of problems. What I really want you to look at is the last verse of the chapter, verse 38, and how Jacob leaves things. Jacob said, my son shall not go down with you, for his brother is dead, and he alone is left. If harm should befall him on the journey you are taking, then you will bring my gray hair down to Sheol in sorrow. In other words, you'll just kill me, and I'll be sad. Tell me some of the things really quickly that you get out of Jacob's statement. A couple of things that jump out at you about that little statement that Jacob made. He doesn't trust him, okay. And probably doesn't trust the man in Egypt, probably, a problem there as well. What else?
He's talking to them as if they're not sons.
Yeah, he's talking about the two sons he really loves, right? And who are they? Joseph and Benjamin. And he's got these others here, and then he's got one where? In prison in Egypt? And okay. So Jacob's answer, yes ma'am, is no, we're not doing that. Yes.
And Reuben offered not only his sons, but Jacob's grandson.
Well, that's what I'm saying. It's not a helpful proposition at all. If you're in Jacob's position, you'd probably be more like, you just be quiet and move along. I don't want to hear any more from you. That's not helpful. When you offer a solution that isn't a solution that's compounding the problem, it's just better to not say anything. But Jacob's whole attitude is, I love Joseph, and he got killed on your watch. You really think I'm going to let you take Benjamin down to Egypt? That's his response. And that's where the chapter ends. And then we get to chapter 43, and it starts like this. Now the famine was severe in the land. So it came about when they had finished eating the grain which they had brought from Egypt, that their father said to them, go back, buy us a little food. I don't know how you read that, but the way I read that, Jacob's kind of hoping nobody will bring up what's already transpired about all that. We just need you to make a quick trip down to Egypt, gather up a little bit of food for us, and come back. No problems. Don't want any problems. Well, now Judah speaks up. We hadn't heard much from Judah. Judah speaks up and says, can't do it. They refer to Joseph from this point on quite a bit as the man. Yeah, which is a significant thing. He is in Egypt the man. That's who he is, and that's how they refer to him. And so Judah says, the man said, don't come back down here without your youngest brother. Don't do that. And so Judah continues, if you send our brother, we will go down and we will buy you food. If you do not send him, we will not go down. For the man said, don't come down here without your youngest brother. Beginning of verse 6, Jacob starts on this family complaining business of this is all y'all's fault anyway. Why'd you tell him you had brothers? Why did you get into all that? You created the problem to begin with. And it's as if he is simply saying, all I ask you to do is go get some grain, and look where we are. And I see his perspective. I mean, from his perspective, he wasn't able to do it himself. He had to entrust it to them. He told them to go do it, and it's all messed up. And so from his point of view, sitting in his chair, what are y'all doing? I mean, everything just gets worse and worse and worse. But there is this problem of the famine. Who in here has experienced a famine on a proportion that might be like this here in the text? Anyone? I've never experienced anything even remotely like that. Well, and I appreciate that because about 11:30 I was sitting in my office and I was really hungry. And then I got an email from Domino's. I kid you not, $6.99 large pizza, 2 toppings. Didn't leave my chair, hit some buttons, drove down there and got a pizza. I didn't eat the whole thing. We had it for dinner, the rest of it. Yeah, but my famine was intensely brief. You know, there was 2 or 3 minutes there where I was really hungry. I have no idea what this is like. And when you think about it, it's hard for us to even comprehend, but I think we are able to kind of project and say, what would it be like if something changed all of the sudden and you didn't have any food and you couldn't go anywhere and buy it? You couldn't buy it because no one else had it. Some folks in here would be fine for a while. I know you would be fine because you're resourceful and capable and you know how to use the ground and everything else, and you would be fine. But not for long, because the rest of us would be over at your house eating what you had. That's just how that'd go. Yes, sir.
It was also a military tactic at that time. One of the military tactics was that the marauding armies could go in and either take the crops or destroy the crops instead of just kind of leaving them.
Kind of reminds me of what the German army did going toward Russia, into Leningrad, and the way they just destroyed everything. And then had their own problems of not being able to get resupplied and get food and all of that. It's one of those things that we can kind of project ourselves into it if we'll think about it for a minute, but we've never lived it. We've never lived that kind of desperation. And so I can see Jacob here, in a sense, saying there's a lot of things going on, but what we need is some food. That's what we need.
This not only affected people, it affected the animals also that they were,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
when it's food for both.
That's a good point. A famine is not the grocery store's out of food. A famine is the land can't produce, and therefore everything that requires food, and sometimes water's an issue as well, depending on where you are, but it's just extreme. And so I don't want to be unfair because I can't relate to that, but I do believe it is recorded for us in a particular way so we will see what is happening here. Jacob still, beginning in verse 6, Israel still says, "Why have you treated me so badly? You told this fellow about all of our family doings, and now you have created this mess." From his perspective, I see where that is. But I also see where Judah's coming from. Like, we just went to get some grain, and then the whole world exploded. I don't know what happened. He started asking questions, we started answering them, and all of a sudden, here we are. Yes, sir.
He started asking questions, all he said was, "You're spies." And they said, "Oh, no, we're 12 brothers."
No, we're not. It's a bad situation. Verse 13, chapter 43. "Take your brother also and arise and return to the man." And then he adds this, which is just beautiful. "And may God Almighty grant you compassion in the sight of the man, so that he will release to you your other brother and Benjamin. As for me, if I am bereaved of my children, I'm bereaved of my children." We have no choice. Yes, sir.
Do you think it's possible that Jacob set this whole thing in motion when he showed favoritism?
I was kind of hoping you wouldn't bring that up. Very possible. His father showed favoritism. And I'm not talking about, I like your hobbies more than I like your hobbies. We're not talking about that kind of, that's not even favoritism. We're not talking about that. We're talking about extreme. This one I love, this one not so much. Jacob grew up in that. Jacob has persisted in that. And we saw that back over in chapter 37. So yes, to a degree. But I do not believe that Jacob is responsible for those 10 brothers throwing Joseph in the pit and selling him. Whatever Jacob did is on Jacob, and what they did is on them. And everybody's got to sort that out and do the best they can to overcome their own problems. And so that's kind of how I look at it. When we get to this point, what somebody did 13 years ago is done. What are you going to do today? How are you going to handle it today? What's your response today? And that's one of the good lessons for us, I guess, throughout all of the text. So Jacob says, "Take your brother, Benjamin, and just go. And maybe God will be with you. Maybe God will grant you compassion in the sight of the man." And so they took off and they went. Now we get into Joseph seeing Benjamin. And this is where it gets, again, a little bit more interesting. They were afraid in verse 18. They are afraid, and they're afraid that he's going to make them slaves. That one stuck out to me. Why do you figure that stuck out to me? That the brothers were afraid Joseph, the vice Pharaoh, is going to make them slaves. What's the connection between irony? Yeah. They sold their brother into slavery. And now they have big wide eyes going, uh-oh, we might become slaves.
Double irony, they ultimately would be.
They ultimately would be, yeah.
4 generations or so later, they ultimately would be.
Yeah. So they are in an odd position because Joseph invites them to their home, to his home, and that's what causes them to say, well, this is not typical, this is not normal. Normal is we transact business out there, he asks us some questions, and we go on our way. This is a whole nother situation, and that's where we have Joseph's, the fellow in his house talking to them, and that's important. Verse 23, he says, "Be at ease, do not be afraid. Your God and the God of your father has given you treasure in your sacks. I had your money." Then he brought Simeon out to them. So they're concerned that they were sent home with their money. You remember that in the reading. They went to buy, they got grain, they get home, we had our money also. So we actually didn't pay for the grain. So they're nervous about that. They figure that's going to cause them to be slaves here when all the settling up occurs. But Joseph's fellow that runs his house, verse 19, his house steward says, no, your God and the God of your father has given you your money back. He was taking care of you. So that references back to Joseph and what this fellow knows about Joseph, which is kind of interesting for us. So then Joseph comes home, he sees Benjamin, and what happens then? Just give me a quick little synopsis. When Joseph sees Benjamin, he's overcome with emotion. Yeah, he is. Say what you will about Joseph, but he had a sensitive side to him with people, his dealings with people. And I kind of respect that. And we see that here several times. He has to step aside for a minute and gather himself. Yes, ma'am.
I think he may have changed over those 13 years too, because he did some things that were not recommended, like bragging a little bit.
Now, Paula, he was 17 years old.
And 13 years later now, he can put all of that aside and be good to.
A whole new perspective. Yeah, and we'll wrap up with that. But we got to hurry. But isn't that remarkable to see everybody coming from where they were to a new place? Yes, which we're going to Sunday morning in the auditorium classes on forgiveness, which is why we're really not going to emphasize the forgiveness aspect of all this tonight, because Sunday morning's coming up. Next verse 33, Joseph seated them around the table after he regained his composure, seated them around the table in birth order. And how did they respond to that? Well, that was something, wasn't it? That was something. Look at verse 33. Now when they were seated before him, the firstborn according to his birthright and the youngest according to his youth, the men looked at one another in astonishment. That's one of those moments you wish you could have been there and just see what was going on, really. Because they had to have gone, what? What's this? You know, it's just amazing that he would be able to do that. And then he took portions to them from his own table, but Benjamin's portion was 5 times as much as any of theirs. Why do you figure 5 times as much? Is there any significance to that, or is that just one of those things that happen that you probably think has no significance? Yeah, he was the son his father loved. The others, they don't get as much. What do you think? Yeah, the only thing I know about that is he is the youngest, and Joseph was the youngest one with them, and he is trying to figure out, I would imagine, how do they relate to Benjamin? And is somebody going to get their feelings hurt when Benjamin gets 5 times as much? Is somebody down the line all around the table going to say, wait a minute, why is he getting more? Do we still have that kind of stuff going on in my family, or have we grown up beyond that, is really what it's probably about. Mm-hmm.
And in that, he says that leaves, in verse 34, Joseph sets it up so that Benjamin is favored. He wants to see how the brothers will react to such favored treatment. They abandoned the favoring.
That's it. That's the way I would view that, because all of this is a sort of a test. Joseph is trying to figure out where they are. Have they progressed? Have they grown up? Do they have a different attitude? Is the family dynamic still what it was, or is it better? And he's bringing them to a particular point. And so we're going to speed up a little bit and move right on into chapter 44. This is when he kind of sets them up for the grand finale. And so you know how this goes. He told his house steward, verse 1, fill the men's sacks with food as much as they can carry, put each man's money in the mouth of his sack. Same situation. Don't charge them for the grain. Give them their money back. But verse 2, put my cup, the silver cup, in the mouth of the sack of the youngest, and his money for the grain. And his man did as he was told. And then you remember how it goes. They head out. As soon as they get going, Joseph's folks come out there and stop them. And here's what they say in verse 5. Is not this the one from which my Lord drinks, which he indeed uses for divination? You have done wrong in doing this. So 2 different times this silver cup that Joseph had, that was Joseph's cup, is referred to as a cup of divination. Joseph refers to it that way in verse 15. If you jump ahead into verse 15, he says that. He says, what is this deed you have done? Do you not know that such a man as I can indeed practice divination? Does anybody read a little differently? It's important for us. Anybody read a little differently? A Christian Standard Bible says something to the effect of, do you not know that I can determine the truth? Something like that. A man like me can determine the truth. So, do we just read through this and conclude that Joseph is some sort of an idolater all of a sudden, that he's some sort of a warlock, and he has this cup, that he's one of these folks that we don't necessarily conclude that. So what might be happening here? What might be the thing that's going on? What fits the circumstance for the, quote, cup of divination? Does Joseph's servant know that he believes in God? Yes, he does. Has Joseph already said he believes in God? Yeah, he has not left God. Okay, then what do you figure about this? Well, the brothers see Joseph not as Joseph. They see him as what? An Egyptian. A high-powered Egyptian who, by the way, if you look back at verse 33, knows things about us that we haven't told him. He knows things about us that he shouldn't know. He has figured out some things. And so really what you have here is Joseph in the setup is attaching significance to this cup just to make this cup special. That's really what he's doing. And he's saying, I know things about you that you don't think I know. And he's using that cup as the thing because he's an Egyptian. That's what the Egyptians would do. And he's playing that role as an Egyptian. That's the best I can do with the cup of divination. That's the filter through which I see it, and that's kind of how I deal with it. I'm not hard-headed about it, but that's kind of how I do it. But we got to move on because I really want to get to this. So the end result is Benjamin's going to be a slave because the cup was found in Benjamin's sack, right? So that makes perfect sense. Verse 17, Joseph says, I'm not going to keep all of you here. I'm only going to keep the guilty one. But Judah says, wait a minute. So before Judah says, wait a minute, take me, Judah says in verse 16, listen to Judah. What can we say to my Lord? What can we speak? And how can we justify ourselves? God has found out the iniquity of your servants. Behold, we are my Lord's slaves, both we and the one in whose possession the cup has been found. The first thing Judah does, not Reuben the oldest, the first thing Judah does is he says, we're all guilty and we'll all pay. We're all going to be your slaves. That's just the way it is. We're going to do it. Joseph says, no, you're not. I'm not keeping all of you. That wouldn't be right. I'm only going to keep the guilty one. Then Judah says, take me. Take me. Let the lad go and keep me. Have you ever wondered why the Lord came through Judah and not, the priestly line of Levi or something like that? I don't know that there's any way to understand that with any great certainty other than what's revealed in the text, but I have often wondered about the tribe of Judah here and what we see Judah doing here. The significant thing to me is Judah says, take the innocent, don't punish the guilty. As far as Judah knows, Benjamin is guilty. It was found in his sack. As far as he knows, he was guilty. Judah says, don't do that. Take me instead. And so a lot of times we talk about how Joseph is a type of Christ. Is Joseph a type of Christ? Yes. There is some really good comparisons and parallels to be made that show us that Joseph is a type of Christ. But do not ever forget that in this moment, Judah becomes an extreme type of Christ because he simply says, take me. And I love that. And so we see the brothers, I know we're out of time, we see the brothers coming a long way in those 13 years. And I would think coming a long way from the beginning of this story. The story is designed to bring about their return. I've got some observations, 3 observations. You can look at those on the screen, see what you think about those. But the story is significant because it's designed to bring them to the point, well, God wanted them to arrive at. Thanks for your help.